co-panelists.com. Welcome, Clinton.
Thank you, Lance. Yes, very happy to present my paper here. I'm here under the wonderful auspices of the McLuhan Institute, which is being started up by, or has been running for a while, by Andrew McLuhan. So he's graciously had me as an affiliate researcher with the Institute. I'm in Ottawa, so basically I've spent the last year or so going through the McLuhan archives here in Ottawa at Library and Archives Canada, formerly known as the National Archives of Canada, variously digitizing documents for Andrew and studying to my heart's content all sorts of wonderful unpublished stuff. I really recommend you guys check out the McLuhaninstitute.com to learn more about Andrew's work as he documents the reading library of his father, Eric. So, in particular, what I've chosen to write about is, in fact, a book by Norbert Wiener, the MIT cyberneticist who in 1963 released a book, God and Golem, the byline of which is a comment on certain points where cybernetics impinges on religion. Now, McLuhan owned this book. You can't tell from the annotations when exactly he read it, but at the time of the book's publication, McLuhan had been working on developing Understanding Media, which came out shortly afterwards. I spent some time in Toronto in December at the Rare Book Library, the Fisher Rare Book Library, reading through and analyzing McLuhan's annotations of this Norbert Wiener book, and they are absolutely awesome. I think the first one I'd like to point out, I've created a humble facsimile of here, is the heading of chapter 4, or excuse me, chapter 6, wherein Norbert Wiener writes, thus, one of the great future problems we must face is that of the relation between man and machine, of the functions which should properly be assigned to these two agencies. And McLuhan seems to have taken some umbrage that this was a future problem, having circled the word future and added an exclamation mark. The idea that Norbert Wiener in 1963 was only just now approaching the topics that he had been working on since the 40s would have been confirmation for him for sure of his rearview mirror ideas. Now, if you read a little further down, you can see in this paragraph that Wiener spends a large part of the book discussing, of course, man-machine merger and the agency which ought to be applied to two of them, whether or not machines have agency the way that we do, or and whether or not they extend us. You can read N. Catherine Hale's book, How We Became Posthuman, for more unpacking of that topic. Of interest also is that in a 1951 letter to Ezra Pound, McLuhan actually told Pound that those guys at MIT, or the crowd at MIT, he said, were, quote, had more promise than all the literary blokes on this continent. So that he, of course, was talking about Norbert Wiener et al. So he had been following all of their work very closely. Now, what's interesting here is that in this book, I'm going to get to more of the contents later, but in this book, we already see evidence of this idea of a split between, in this case, Norbert Wiener discussing the agency of a machine and the agency of people. Now, McLuhan himself had been collecting, basically, diagnoses of a sort of split in the mind. For his own part, he focused on the classical trivium of dialectic versus rhetoric and grammar. If you read his Nash thesis, you can see how he applies his perception of the performance of dialectic and versus the performance of rhetoric and grammar throughout the entire age of the patricians and the scholastics, and variously discussing how sometimes people are taught to perform rhetorically and then underneath that work on their dialectic, or sometimes dialectic comes first and foremost, and then people subsume the act of actual rhetoric and grammar underneath that. Of course, I can't get much into it beyond that. Suffice it to say that in the 40s, when McLuhan was finishing his essay, he was thinking entirely in words. He was, quote, a typographical person through and through. He hadn't yet awakened to his the perceptions in the 50s that would lead to his media theories, which got underneath words themselves as purely constitutive of meaning or thought. So I'm going to go through a couple other thinkers whose works I've been studying the past few years to try and understand more of the split that McLuhan ends up attempting to resolve through his performative displays as a Menippean satirist media scholar. Some of the people who are very influential on McLuhan's development. One person with whom he confided heavily was Eric Voegelin, who, in a series of letters back and forth, they discussed the nature of what Voegelin calls gnosticism, which is a very strange use of the term. Voegelin was a political theorist who wrote a book called The New Science of Politics, wherein he basically lays out this definition of the Gnostic as someone who has a dream system in their head that they're projecting onto the world and trying to instantiate. They've fallen from their other world to which they truly belong on the inside. Their identity is split from their bodily involvement in the world, and the world itself is perceived as fallen and broken, and it's their job to come in and save the world. Right? It's a sort of a pneuma pathology, as Eric Voegelin took it, trying to bring the idea of like pathological thinking outside of the medical context, to use the spiritual term pneuma, right? Pneuma pathological thinking of Gnosticism. Now, Eric Voegelin was railed upon by all sorts of people who despised his usurpation of the study of Gnosticism for his particular political ends. But in reading their letters, you can see that they both agree that the idea of people being possessed by ideas and projecting a world, their own perception of the world onto the world in lieu of living in it, certainly forms a lot of the common substance, which ends up in a Plato's cave sort of way, leading to his rear view mirror theories. Another, so let me just be explicit here. Eric Voegelin defined the split in the modern psyche between the alienated Gnostics, identified home or origins, and the attainable world from which we've fallen and might return in the classical biblical fall sense, versus, split off from the unfathomable absolute of reality and dwelling in it. Another definition of the psychological split, which McLuhan would go on to try and mend with his media theories, it would be those of Siegfried Giedion, who was a Swiss architectural historian and art historian, whose books Mechanization Takes Command and Space-Time and Architecture, of course, were McLuhan references those books in basically every one of his pieces. And Siegfried Giedion, I've got a whole video on my YouTube about it, in those books discusses the split between thinking and feeling, or mind and heart, as he sees it expressed in the production of artists, in handicrafts, and then made with what he called equipoise, or a balance of humanity and machine. And then industrialism, the rise of industry and mechanization, tilts the playing field entirely towards the utility of engineering and the ugliness of scaffolding and the factory state and all this sort of thing. And the artists split off from that entirely in reaction and became obsessed with nostalgia and soft, squishy upholstery and comfort and the revival of classical styles without any sense of the practical work that they were doing, or function, or form. So Siegfried Giedion gave McLuhan a language for analyzing media, because as all human artifice, media in McLuhan's sense entails the ability to, entails everything that was made by human hands and created. The entire dynamics of the tetrad apply to the world, the environment which we are co-creating and building and inventing. Siegfried Giedion, in fact, poured through hundreds of patents looking for the way machines worked, trying to see how, whether or not the mechanism behind them or the utility of them blended in with the human intention. The last person we're going to go to in depth is Winston Lewis, who, of course, wrote Time and Western Man, which is a book that I'm focusing on specifically. And in that book, he focuses on tactility, the idea of the inner sensorium being integrated by touch, which can verify things that the eye alone might be tricked by. So he was a visual artist, but unlike I've heard intimations that he was very much a typographical person, thinking of the eye in isolation. No, he's trying to reunite touch as a verification of the things we see, so as we can break out of illusion, which gets to the core of my work, because as a computer nerd, geek, I touch every part of my computer in building the operating system. I've got my free phone that doesn't really run Android or Apple, but is a free open Linux platform that I can format and change to my heart's contents. All the guts are exposed to me. I would never use an iPhone, right? The idea of being a hacker basically is the lifestyle, which is more and more ubiquitous. But the actual details of how the computer works, when you're not in touch with them, for instance, children with screwdrivers. Alessandro Colombi's presentation last year really got into how our hands need to get in touch with, as children, developmentally the world through using knives in the kitchen and taking things apart and getting in touch with the world. And his presentation was about how not getting in touch with the material reality of the world that we're made of leaves kids with body dysmorphia. Anyway, blowing back through the rest of this, so some other interesting people would be Bergson, Maritain, and Deleuze. Bergson basically seeming to be the ground for all of this stuff. We see Winston Lewis reacting against Bergson in Time and Western Man, and the whole idea there is the idea of people living in the moment, in the now, duration by duration by duration, but the inability for those to perhaps flow with any continuity, leading to a fracturing of identity and perception of the world, creating the modern consumer who's amenable to advertisements and whatnot. So from there, McLuhan wrote his second book, I should say. Well, third. Anyway, Typhon in America is the book that eventually became Mechanical Bride. I've torn it apart up and down. You can see all that in my paper. The point being that in this book, he's a very angry man reacting to how dumb everyone is. It's the sort of the height peak moral McLuhan, and lots of it comes through in the Mechanical Bride. Everyone's an idiot. School's terrible, right? We got to burn schools to the ground because they're doing it all wrong and they're spoiling the kids. And we're living in a bunch of dagwoods. One thing that he's very specific on in the book is the inflation of the ego to maniacal Superman stance compared to the whittling down of people into masochistic little cogs in the machine by vocational training. School just teaches, right, like takes the human being and whittles them down into a cog to go fit in the machine with some specialist skill that's going to be obsolete 10 years from now anyway, right? He's very much concerned about what Nietzsche talked about as, I saw a man who was just an ear, right? The whole idea of your perception and your relationship to your environment as a distortion. Now, my point is that by the 50s, after considering all of these fellows, especially T.S. Eliot, and the idea of, what's the essay? Tradition and the Individual Talent talks about how it's the artist's job to take on all of history, and the same way that Bergson would say memory is modified by our continuing experience, we take on all of history and assume it and change the past by our relation to it and bringing it into the present. In that way, McLuhan started a civil war in his head, a paranoid civil war where he was accusing all of his artist friends of doing black mass stuff, and he was basically undergoing the change of himself from the typographical rigid thinker into what became known as the person who doesn't make value judgments and was free to go hang out with Yoko Ono and become an pal around with advertisers and go investigate go-go dancers, and right, he allowed himself to go explore all the things that he was scared of. He was clearly a technophobe, but he explored and studied all the media as much as possible. He ran into his fears. He did this through what he described in understanding media as the violent motion of the typographical man undergoing fusion, having to reconcile find a way to reconcile all of the incommensurate or parts of his rational mind that needed to basically battle it out and take it on. He talks a lot about integrality in his quips about Humpty Dumpty, for instance. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again because they were bureaucrats. His celebration of the dropout as someone who's totally dropped out of the system as the sort of person who is necessary to gain perception, someone outside of business or academia, right, being in already the hidden ground of cultures, constitutive institutions, and societies, right? How their perspective is essential to seeing the world, and that's precisely because these people are by being out of the institutions are free to engage in the civil wars in their head and actually test their hypotheses, whereas someone ensconced in the institution has something to lose, and so it is more susceptible to go along with bullet points and stuff. What ended up happening is we got the McLuhan we saw, who was able to play peekaboo with the Bergsonian time fluxed through the cracks in their cubist reality. His cubist perception allowed him to recognize how all the distended and distorted figures within the rearview mirror, whom he had previously been throwing shade on, he now brought this Christian sense of love and understanding and acceptance. It's sort of like how if one sheep runs off, then the good shepherd finds it to bring it back to the 99. But when 99 of the sheep run off, the good shepherd realizes that it's the pasture that's moved, not the sheep, and that he's the one who has to follow them. That's McLuhan's ultimate movement into the the electric medium, right? It was a civil war in his head, so I'm calling it McLuhan 2 Electric Boogaloo. Yeah, the world today is for people immersed in the content, the sort of world where you're standing at your screen I'm looking at all of you here. You're like sea monkeys in my little dish, right? In my little, fish tank. And then when I go outside, I put on my sea monkey costume and walk outside. And now I am, in this recursive sort of sense, inside the tank that I had just been looking over from my computer screen. This is the cubist perspective of people who are in the media content. Another way to look at it is in the Fraggle Rock metaphor, where the Fraggles are these giants lording over the little world built by the doozers who are going around constructing it inside of their computer. Think of all the computer programmers at Microsoft or Apple as being inside your computer right now, changing it around every time you receive a software update. That's the sort of world that modern media has brought us into in a superficial sense. Just to wrap it up, what we see in God and Golem Incorporated is that Wiener likens this world to Wonderland, where people either, if they don't know the full rules of the game, what McLuhan says in his annotations, if they're not hot players actually playing by the rules of the game, then they become cool players playing the learning game of immersion and feeling their way through the world. But studying the media itself is essential to knowing what it is that you're feeling, because if you're not feeling the actual technology or the machines first to get through the materiality of the world, then you're opening yourself up to manipulation by those who would manipulate you through the high-level illusory content. In that case, you end up in the Red Queen's game of croquet, according to Norbert Wiener. You end up in this world where the Red Queen makes the rules and you play to win to please her, but she can play the rules anytime. That's literally what it means to try and win at social media nowadays, to win in a credibility game, to win an internet flame war, to win anything in media today when you're ignoring the ground is to be playing in Wonderland. Hence, look at Jonathan Piaget's mentioning of the clown world that we live in, or the common refrain of calling people NPCs or LARPers. All these YouTube celebrities who are gaining a following are addressing this issue, and I'd like to bring media ecology to bear on that. I hope my paper goes a way towards trying to bridge McLuhan to a discussion of our current social context. Thank you.